Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide restless secrets and the smallest detail can change everything. Tonight's tale begins in the gentle mist of St. Wycliffe, where a single sound in the night unsettles an entire community. Settle in, listen closely, and let the calm voices of the countryside guide you into a mystery where truth waits patiently to be heard. Chapter 1. It was Mrs. Price who first said it, lowering her voice as though the morning itself might be listening. She leaned across the small round tea table at the vicarage and whispered that she had woken in the night to a sound that did not belong to wind or owl or shifting branch. It had been thin and sharp, she said, like a breath forced out too quickly. Then she laughed. But the laugh did not quite settle into comfort. It lingered in the air, brittle as autumn leaves. The vicar's wife hurried to say it was surely nothing more than the moor playing tricks. St. Wycliffe had always been a village where noises became stories before breakfast and were forgotten by supper. That same pale morning mist lay low over the hedgerows, pressing gently against the windows of cottages as if reluctant to move on. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair by her front window, a small porcelain cup warming her hands. She had a habit of observing the village at certain hours, not from curiosity exactly, but from long practice in human nature. People, she often believed, were most honest in their routines, and it was routine that caught her attention now. At precisely 8:30 each morning, Mrs. Harper of Rosebank Cottage drew back her lace curtains with firm and punctual hands. It had been so for years. That morning the curtains remained closed, pale fabric hanging motionless behind the glass. Miss Marple did not frown. She rarely did. But she placed her cup down with unusual care. Rosebank Cottage stood slightly apart from the main row of houses, its small garden bordered with lavender and white stones that Mrs. Harper kept arranged with near military neatness. From her vantage point, Miss Marple could see that even the garden gate remained latched. No milk bottle had been brought in. The thin trail of chimney smoke, one expected at that hour, was absent. By 9 o'clock, the milkman had begun his usual cheerful knocking along the lane. He was a broad man with red cheeks and a voice that carried easily. When he reached Rosebank Cottage, his knock was louder than necessary. No answer came. He knocked again, then tried the door. It opened inward with a slow and uncertain movement. Miss Marple, watching from her window, noted the way he hesitated before stepping inside. It was not long before the quiet of the village shifted. There is a particular silence that descends when something has happened that cannot be undone. It is different from ordinary quiet. It is heavier. It travels quickly. Mrs. Harper was found in her sitting room, seated in her armchair near the small fireplace. One hand rested loosely at her side, the other against the arm of the chair. Her face held an expression that the doctor later described as peaceful. The doctor himself, a careful and kindly man, declared that her heart must have failed in the night. She had not been robust, he said gently. Age and nerves had likely taken their toll. The words were accepted with relief. Heart failure was tidy. It asked for no further questions. Yet even as the doctor spoke, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Price kept pressing her fingers together in her lap, as though smoothing something invisible. The vicar's wife nodded too vigorously, and Edward Harper, standing stiffly by the window, seemed less stricken than inconvenienced. His eyes did not linger on his wife. They flicked instead toward the mantelpiece, then to the door, as if measuring something unseen. Over tea that afternoon at the vicarage, the conversation circled carefully around the event. There was talk of how sudden it had been, how unfortunate, how fragile life could be. Then, as though drawn by a thread, Mrs. Price returned to the matter of the sound in the night. It was not loud, she insisted softly, but it was sharp. The vicar smiled in gentle correction. The moor can produce remarkable echoes. Young Thomas Bell, who had been sent to fetch sugar from the pantry and had lingered near the doorway, piped up that he had seen a light flicker at Rosebank Cottage near midnight. His mother immediately hushed him, saying children often imagine things when they wake unexpectedly. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Children, she said in her mild voice, are quite often very accurate observers. They simply lack the vocabulary to explain what they see. The remark passed lightly, but Edward Harper's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Later that day, Miss Marple walked slowly past Rosebank Cottage under the pretense of admiring the late roses. The front windows were closed tightly, more tightly than the mild weather required. In fact, she noticed that every window along the side of the cottage was firmly shut. Mrs. Harper had always preferred fresh air. It had been a topic of mild amusement in the village that she would insist on opening windows even in early spring. Miss Marple paused at the small stone path leading to the door. The garden was neat, but not freshly tended. A small pair of pruning shears lay on the bench beside the lavender bush. That, in itself, meant nothing. Yet the blades were open, as though set down mid-task. She glanced toward the sitting-room window. The curtains were now drawn halfway, unevenly. Edward Harper stood inside, speaking to the doctor once more. His voice carried faintly through the glass. Calm. Controlled. That evening, as the mist began to gather again at the edges of the fields, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Linton, who had known Mrs. Harper since girlhood. Mrs. Linton spoke in a hushed, unsettled way. She did mention being uneasy, Mrs. Linton said, adjusting her spectacles. Not ill, exactly. Just uneasy. As though something was not as it should be. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Did she say what troubled her? Mrs. Linton hesitated. No. Only that she felt watched. I told her it was nonsense. There was a small silence after that. Did she often imagine such things? Miss Marple asked gently. Oh, no, Mrs. Linton said quickly. Emily Harper was practical to the bone. If she said she felt uneasy, I dare say she had reason. Outside, a faint breeze stirred the hedges, brushing leaves against one another with a soft whisper. The following morning brought further whispers. The postmistress mentioned that Mrs. Harper had posted a letter 2 days prior, looking quite serious as she did so. A letter to London, she believed. The detail was shared casually, yet it lingered. Miss Marple, upon hearing this, merely nodded. She did not ask what sort of letter. Not yet. Instead, she paid a visit to Edward Harper under the guise of offering condolences. He received her politely, but with a distracted air. The sitting room was tidy. Too tidy. The small round table beside Mrs. Harper's chair held a single teacup, washed and placed neatly on its saucer. Miss Marple had visited often enough to know that Mrs. Harper sometimes left her cup until morning. How sudden it all was, Miss Marple murmured. Yes, Edward replied, his tone even. Quite sudden. And you heard nothing in the night? She asked, as though in idle curiosity. He hesitated, only a fraction of a second. Nothing at all. Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly to the fireplace. The ashes appeared recently cleared. The grate polished. It was an efficient sort of cleanliness. As she rose to leave, she noticed a faint mark near the cuff of Edward's sleeve. A smudge. Perhaps soot. It might have been nothing. On her walk home, she encountered Mrs. Price again, who seemed eager to repeat that the cry she heard had likely been a fox. Yet her tone had shifted. It carried a faint urgency, as though she wished very much for that explanation to be accepted. Miss Marple smiled kindly and agreed that foxes could produce remarkable sounds. But she remembered the word Mrs. Price had used first. Sharp. A fox's call lingered. It rose and fell. A human cry, when cut short, did not. That night, the mist returned, thicker than before. It pressed against Rosebank Cottage as though keeping its own counsel. Inside, Edward Harper sat alone in the lamplight. The village had already settled into a careful sympathy, ready to close the matter with neat finality. Yet in her small sitting room, Miss Marple sat very still, recalling every remark, every hesitation, every closed window. A sound had been heard. A light had flickered. Curtains had not been drawn at their appointed hour. And Miss Marple, folding her hands gently in her lap, understood that in a village like St. Wycliffe, the most dangerous thing was not a cry in the night. It was the silence that followed it. Chapter 2. It was Mrs. Linton who said, in a tone half pity and half curiosity, that grief showed itself in curious ways. She had noticed, she confided over a morning cup of tea, that Mr. Edward Harper had not shed a single tear at the small prayer gathering. Not one. He had stood straight, hands folded behind his back, thanking each visitor with the same measured politeness he might use at a garden 50. Some men go very quiet, Mrs. Linton added quickly, as if to correct herself. It does not mean anything. Yet she stirred her tea far longer than necessary, her spoon tapping lightly against the porcelain. The village had entered that peculiar stage of mourning where sympathy blends with speculation. Doors closed more softly, voices lowered, and yet, at every gate and hedgerow, the same question drifted like the lingering fog. Had anyone truly heard that sound in the night? Miss Marple moved through these conversations as she always did, not directing them, merely allowing them to unfold. She attended the small prayer service at the church, where the pews were filled with neighbors who had known Mrs. Harper for decades. The vicar spoke gently about sudden partings and the mystery of the human heart. Miss Marple, seated near the aisle, observed rather than listened. She watched hands, shoulders, glances. Edward Harper sat in the front pew, his expression composed. Too composed, perhaps. When Mrs. Price leaned toward him with whispered condolences, he inclined his head without quite meeting her eyes. His fingers, resting along the edge of the pew, drummed once before becoming still again. It was a tiny movement, almost invisible, but Miss Marple noticed. Behind them, Clara Weston, the schoolteacher, kept her gaze fixed forward. She was pale, though the church was warm. When the vicar mentioned how peaceful Mrs. Harper had looked, Clara's lips parted slightly, as though she might speak, but she did not. After the service, the congregation drifted into the churchyard, where conversation resumed in careful fragments. Mrs. Price remarked, a little too brightly, that at least Mrs. Harper had not suffered. The doctor, standing nearby, nodded and said the passing had likely been swift. The heart can give way without warning, he explained. Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, asked in her mild voice whether Mrs. Harper had ever complained of heart trouble before. The doctor hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Nothing specific, he admitted. Some nervousness. Fatigue. Nervousness? Mrs. Linton echoed, frowning. She never struck me as fanciful. Edward Harper stepped closer then, his tone firm but courteous. Emily was prone to worry. She imagined difficulties where none existed. The remark settled oddly. Miss Marple observed the way Clara Weston's shoulders stiffened at those words. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Rosebank Cottage under the gentle excuse of returning a borrowed book. Edward received her in the sitting room. The air felt different from her last visit. Windows that were usually open an inch or two were sealed shut. Even the small vent above the fireplace was closed. It has been rather warm, Miss Marple observed lightly. Yes, Edward replied, crossing to the mantelpiece. I prefer things secure. Secure. It was an interesting choice of word. Miss Marple's gaze moved discreetly around the room. The furniture was orderly, the mantelpiece dusted, yet the small round table beside Mrs. Harper's chair caught her attention again. The teacup rested precisely centered on its saucer, its surface gleaming. The spoon lay parallel to the edge of the table, as though arranged deliberately. Emily always said a tidy table made for a tidy mind, Edward remarked, following her glance. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. And yet she was known, from time to time, to leave things until morning. Edward's smile tightened, not recently. There was a pause then, faint but noticeable. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to the arm of the chair where Mrs. Harper had been found. A faint discoloration marked the fabric near the edge, barely visible unless one knew to look. Perhaps it was nothing more than shadow, or perhaps something had brushed against it with more force than intended. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift toward the side table near the window. The curtains were drawn, though it was still afternoon. She touched the edge lightly. Such heavy fabric for summer, she remarked. Edward's tone sharpened, only slightly. Emily preferred privacy. Privacy. Windows closed on a warm night. Curtains drawn tightly. A sound described as sharp and sudden. On her walk home, Miss Marple encountered the postmistress, who spoke in lowered tones about a letter Mrs. Harper had sent days earlier. Addressed to a solicitor in London, she said. Looked important. Did she seem distressed? Miss Marple asked gently. The postmistress considered. Determined, I would say. Quite firm. Determination did not sit comfortably beside the notion of fragile nerves. By early evening, another small detail emerged. The maid who came twice weekly to assist at Rosebank Cottage mentioned that on the morning before Mrs. Harper's passing, all the windows had been open wide. She remembered, because she had commented on the draft. Mrs. Harper said she could not bear stale air, the maid explained. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That night, as twilight deepened over St. Wycliffe, she sat by her window once more. Across the lane, Rosebank Cottage stood dim and quiet. No soft glow of lamplight now, no movement behind lace curtains. She replayed each remark in her mind. The doctor's hesitation, Edward's insistence on nervousness, the spotless teacup, the sealed windows. And there was something else. At the churchyard earlier, when Mrs. Price had once again referred to the cry as wind, she had glanced briefly at Edward before speaking. It was a quick look, but it carried a question, or perhaps a warning. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences of that sort. The following morning brought another ripple of unease. Young Thomas Bell mentioned, in the careless honesty of youth, that he had seen Mr. Harper outside the cottage well after midnight the night of the passing. He was closing the shutters, the boy said. I remember because the clock had just struck 12. His mother silenced him at once, insisting he must be mistaken. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on the image, closing shutters at midnight on a warm night. After a cry described as sharp and cut short, she imagined the sequence quietly. A sound, a light flicker, windows sealed. If a heart failed suddenly, there would be no reason to close the world out so carefully. That afternoon, she encountered Clara Weston near the lane. The schoolteacher appeared distracted, her usually steady hands fumbling with her satchel clasp. Miss Marple greeted her warmly and spoke of small matters, the children's lessons, the late roses. Clara answered politely, but her voice wavered when Mrs. Harper's name was mentioned. She was a kind woman, Clara said quickly. Very kind. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and not one to imagine threats lightly. Clara's eyes flickered up at that, then away. A subtle change in tone can reveal more than a confession. Miss Marple had long known that truth often hides in what is not said. As dusk settled once again over the village, she found herself returning in thought to the simple fact that every window at Rosebank Cottage had been closed tightly that night. A nervous woman, perhaps, or a woman who wished not to be heard. And if she had cried out, sharp and sudden, who had been near enough to silence the sound? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression gentle, almost serene. Yet behind her mild eyes, each small detail aligned carefully, like pieces placed upon a quiet board. Polite grief can conceal many things. Closed windows can conceal even more. And as the village prepared to lay Mrs. Harper to rest, Miss Marple could not help but feel that someone in St. Wycliffe was grieving not from sorrow, but from fear. For if the cry in the fog had not been wind at all, then it had been meant for someone. And that someone, Miss Marple suspected, was still listening. Chapter 3. It was the postmistress who mentioned the letter again, though this time her voice carried a sharper edge of curiosity. She had not meant to repeat herself, she said, but it troubled her that no reply had yet come from London. Solicitors are prompt people, she added thoughtfully, adjusting the spectacles on her nose. They do not ignore letters marked urgent. The word urgent hung quietly between her and Miss Marple like a thread pulled too tight. Miss Marple received this information with the same mild expression she reserved for jam recipes and church raffles. Yet her mind moved steadily beneath that calm surface. A woman described as nervous had posted an urgent letter to a solicitor 2 days before her passing. A cry had been heard. Windows had been sealed. And now the letter itself seemed to have vanished into polite silence. That afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at Mrs. Linton's cottage, where gossip flowed as gently as the steam from the teapot. The lace curtains fluttered there in open windows, and the air felt fresh. Mrs. Linton spoke in lowered tones about how strange it was that Mrs. Harper's writing desk appeared recently disturbed. "Edward told me he had not touched it," she said, "but I could have sworn the drawer was always kept perfectly straight. Yesterday it was slightly misaligned." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Drawers," she said gently, "are very revealing things. They tend to hold what we do not wish displayed." Mrs. Linton leaned closer. "Do you suppose she was preparing to change something? A will, perhaps?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked whether Mrs. Harper had ever spoken of financial concerns. Mrs. Linton hesitated before admitting that there had been quiet talk of money in recent months. Edward's business, it seemed, was not as secure as once believed. Nothing dramatic, of course. Just minor setbacks. Bills delayed. Payments promised. Outside, the village lane remained peaceful. A cart rolled slowly past. A dog barked once and settled again. Yet beneath the small domestic sounds, something uneasy persisted. The following morning, Miss Marple decided upon a small walk that would take her naturally past Rosebank Cottage. Edward Harper was in the garden, trimming a hedge with determined strokes. He looked up as she approached and offered a tight smile. "Good morning," he said. "The garden must be kept in order." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied kindly. Emily always took such pride in it. At the mention of his wife's name, his shears paused for the briefest instant. "I understand she wrote to London recently," Miss Marple added lightly, as though recalling a trivial matter. Edward resumed trimming. "A routine inquiry. Nothing significant." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "Solicitors often deal in routine matters." There was that slight tightening again around his mouth. "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the sitting-room window. The curtains were drawn once more, though it was a bright morning, and there, just visible near the edge of the frame, was the writing desk. From this angle she could see that one corner bore a faint scratch along the polished surface, as though something sharp had pressed against it. That afternoon, the maid who assisted at Rosebank Cottage confided something further. She had noticed the hearth had been freshly cleaned the day after Mrs. Harper's passing. "Mr. Harper said he could not bear to see ashes lying there," she explained, "but I had cleaned it only the previous day. There would not have been much." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you notice anything unusual among the ashes?" The maid frowned. "Only that they were darker than usual, and there were small bits that did not look like wood. Paper, perhaps. Paper burned in haste leaves fragments even when stirred." Later that evening, Miss Marple encountered Clara Weston near the post office. The schoolteacher appeared pale again, though she attempted a bright smile. "I hear the children have been restless," Miss Marple remarked gently. "Yes," Clara replied quickly. "They sense when something is wrong." "Children do," Miss Marple agreed. "They are sensitive to disturbances." Clara's gaze flickered toward Rosebank Cottage before returning to Miss Marple's face. It was a brief glance, but it held weight. There was something unspoken there. Not grief exactly, not fear alone. Perhaps guilt. "You were close to Mrs. Harper?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clara hesitated. "She confided in me sometimes. About her nerves?" Another pause. "About concerns." "What sort of concerns?" Clara's voice dropped. She believed something was being hidden from her. Miss Marple did not press further. She allowed silence to settle, knowing that silence often invites truth. That night, seated by her lamp, she arranged the pieces quietly in her mind. An urgent letter to a solicitor, a scratched desk drawer, a hearth cleaned too thoroughly, a husband who described his wife as nervous while she described herself as concerned. If Mrs. Harper had discovered something troubling enough to seek legal advice, then the contents of that letter would have been inconvenient to someone. And if that someone feared its arrival in London, there would have been reason to intercept it. The following morning brought another subtle shift. The postmistress mentioned that Edward Harper had inquired whether any official correspondence had arrived in recent days. He seemed anxious to be certain nothing was overlooked, she said. Anxiety, Miss Marple thought, has a habit of revealing itself in practical errands. Later, during a brief visit to Rosebank Cottage, under the pretense of returning a casserole dish, Miss Marple found herself alone for a moment in the sitting room, while Edward fetched something from the kitchen. She allowed her eyes to wander toward the fireplace once more. Though the grate appeared clean, a small blackened fragment rested just beyond the hearth, nearly invisible against the rug. She stooped slowly, as though adjusting her shoe, and lifted it delicately. It was a sliver of thick paper, one edge bearing a faint impression. Not enough to read, but enough to confirm that something more than wood had burned there. She placed it quietly on the mantelpiece before Edward returned, watching his face carefully. His eyes flicked to the fragment and then away. A subtle change, but unmistakable. "Oh," he said lightly, brushing it aside. "Just old rubbish." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Old rubbish has a curious way of lingering." When she left the cottage, the sky had begun to cloud over, the light dimming earlier than usual. The village felt smaller somehow, as though the hedgerows leaned closer to overhear. By evening, a new whisper had begun to circulate. Mrs. Harper had intended, it seemed, to amend her will. The rumor came from the bank manager, who had been consulted weeks before. The document, however, could not be found among her papers. Miss Marple sat very still when she heard this. A letter to a solicitor. A possible change of will. Financial strain. A cry in the night. It was not yet proof. But it was pattern. And patterns, Miss Marple knew, rarely formed without purpose. As the lamplight glowed softly in her sitting room, she reflected on Mrs. Harper's supposed nervousness. Nervous women do not draft urgent letters to solicitors without reason, nor do they close every window on a warm night unless they fear interruption. Somewhere between that letter being written and that cry being heard, something decisive had occurred. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression calm, almost grandmotherly. Yet her thoughts were sharp as the scratch on that writing desk. A letter had been sent. A letter had vanished. Ashes had been cleared too carefully. And as the night deepened over St. Wycliffe, Miss Marple could not escape the quiet certainty that the missing letter had not simply been lost in the post. It had been silenced. And she was beginning to understand exactly who had the most to lose if its words were ever spoken aloud. Chapter 4. Mrs. Price declared, with great certainty and very little prompting, that nothing unsettled the village more than unfinished conversations. She said this while standing at her garden gate, trimming roses that did not particularly require trimming, her eyes alert for anyone willing to linger. The subject, of course, was Rosebank Cottage. The funeral had passed with proper dignity, yet the atmosphere of St. Wycliffe had not returned to its comfortable rhythm. People spoke kindly, but they watched one another more closely now. Even the birds seemed quieter along the hedgerows. Miss Marple paused beside the gate during her morning walk, greeting Mrs. Price warmly. It required very little encouragement for the conversation to turn toward Edward Harper. "He walks about at odd hours," Mrs. Price confided. "I saw him near midnight again 2 evenings ago. Restlessness, I suppose. Though one does wonder what keeps a man pacing after such a tragedy. Grief takes many forms," Miss Marple said gently. Yes, Mrs. Price replied quickly, though her tone suggested uncertainty. Still, he does not look like a grieving man. Miss Marple allowed the remark to settle without agreement. Gossip, she knew, often revealed more about the speaker than the subject, yet within it small truths frequently hid. As she continued along the lane, she noticed Clara Weston ahead near the garden gate of the schoolhouse. The young schoolteacher appeared distracted, her attention fixed not on the children playing nearby, but on Rosebank Cottage in the distance. When she realized Miss Marple had approached, she started slightly, as though recalled from troubling thoughts. "Good morning, Miss Weston," Miss Marple said kindly. "Good morning," Clara replied, adjusting her gloves though the morning was warm. "The children seem lively today." Yes, they do," Clara said, though she had not been watching them at all. Miss Marple observed the faint shadows beneath her eyes and the tightness in her voice. "You must remember to rest," she added gently. "Strain often follows distressing events." Clara hesitated before speaking. Mrs. Harper was worried recently. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Worried people sometimes seek advice," Clara's gaze dropped. Yes, there was more she wished to say. That much was clear. But fear restrained her. Miss Marple did not press. Pressure closes doors. Patience opens them. Later that afternoon, village life resumed its quiet rituals. At the grocer's shop, Mrs. Linton mentioned she had seen Clara Weston leaving Rosebank Cottage late one evening, the week before Mrs. Harper's passing. "Quite late," she added meaningfully. "I assume she was helping with lessons or correspondence." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows mildly. "Miss Weston is a conscientious young woman." Of course, Mrs. Linton agreed quickly. Still, it seemed unusual. Unusual things, Miss Marple reflected, often mattered more than dramatic ones. That evening she walked deliberately past Rosebank Cottage once again. The garden lay in careful order, yet something about it felt abandoned. Edward Harper was not outside. Instead, a faint movement caught her attention near the side path. Clara Weston emerging from the gate, her pace hurried. Clara stopped abruptly upon seeing Miss Marple. "Oh, I was just," she began, then faltered. "Returning a book, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested kindly. "Yes," Clara said quickly, relief flickering across her face. "Yes, exactly." Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes noticed details others might miss. Clara's gloves bore faint gray smudges along the fingertips. Not soil. Finer than that. Ash, perhaps, and there was a faint scent clinging to her coat, the unmistakable trace of smoke. "A pleasant evening for walking," Miss Marple remarked. "Yes," Clara replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "I must return to prepare tomorrow's lessons." She departed quickly, almost too quickly. Miss Marple remained by the gate a moment longer. The sitting-room curtains were drawn again, despite the lingering daylight. A soft glow flickered inside, then vanished, as though someone had moved abruptly past the lamp. Inside the cottage, voices rose faintly, not loud enough to distinguish words, but enough to suggest tension. A man's voice, low and strained. Then, silence. Miss Marple resumed her walk slowly, her thoughts arranging themselves with increasing clarity. The following morning brought another fragment of village talk. The gardener who tended several properties mentioned seeing a small figure near Rosebank Cottage on the night Mrs. Harper died. "Not Mr. Harper," he said confidently. "Too slight for that." Miss Marple listened carefully. "Did you see the face?" "No, ma'am. Only the shape moving along the hedge. A smaller figure. Someone visiting late. Someone perhaps present when the cry was heard." That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Clara Weston for tea. The invitation was accepted with visible hesitation. Clara sat stiffly at first, her teacup untouched. Miss Marple spoke of ordinary things, the school children, the summer weather, the difficulty of keeping roses free from insects. Gradually, Clara relaxed. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "Mrs. Harper trusted you, I think." Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. She spoke to me. About worries. About money? Miss Marple asked gently. Clara's eyes widened. She believed her husband was hiding debts. She feared losing the cottage. Miss Marple nodded softly. That must have been distressing for her. Yes, Clara whispered. She intended to take advice. The letter to London, Miss Marple said calmly. Clara looked up sharply, realizing too late she had confirmed it without words. A silence followed, warm but heavy. You visited her often, Miss Marple continued. Yes. And on the night she died? Clara's breath caught. I heard nothing. Her tone changed subtly. Too firm. Too rehearsed. Miss Marple did not challenge her. Instead, she poured more tea. It is curious, she said thoughtfully, how silence sometimes protects people more than truth. Clara's composure faltered for a moment before she quickly regained it. After she left, Miss Marple sat quietly, reviewing every small observation. The soot on Clara's gloves, the gardener's sighting, the tension between Clara and Edward Harper. Not romance, she thought. Something else. Shared knowledge, perhaps. Shared fear. By evening, another detail emerged. Mrs. Price mentioned that Clara Weston did not own a fireplace in her lodgings, yet her landlady had noticed soot marks recently on her handkerchiefs. Miss Marple smiled faintly at that. The pattern grew clearer, though its meaning was not yet complete. Clara had been present. Of that Miss Marple felt increasingly certain, but presence alone did not explain the sealed windows, the vanished letter, or the sudden quieting of a cry. As twilight settled, Miss Marple walked slowly past the churchyard. The bell tolled softly in the distance. Villagers greeted one another politely, yet conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Fear had entered St. Wycliffe, though no one acknowledged it openly. Miss Marple paused near the hedge overlooking Rosebank Cottage. A lamp burned inside. Edward Harper moved past the window, his posture rigid. Moments later, another shadow crossed behind him. Brief, uncertain. Not a guest, she thought. Someone reluctant to be seen. She turned away, her expression thoughtful. If Clara Weston had visited that night, she might have heard the cry, and if she heard it, her silence now suggested she feared its meaning. Miss Marple folded her hands together as she walked home beneath the deepening sky. People rarely conspire out of wickedness alone. More often, they are drawn into secrecy by panic, loyalty, or shame. Somewhere within Rosebank Cottage, truth had been shared between at least two people, and neither dared speak it aloud. And Miss Marple, moving quietly through the fading light, began to suspect that the cry no one admitted hearing had not been ignored at all. It had been witnessed. And someone in St. Wycliffe was trying very hard to ensure it remained unheard forever. Chapter 5. The first hint came, not as a confession nor even as gossip, but as a careful remark spoken in the subdued atmosphere of the village bank. Mr. Ellery, the bank manager, was a man who believed deeply in discretion, which made it all the more notable that he lingered after Miss Marple completed her small transaction. He adjusted the papers before him several times before speaking, as though weighing the propriety of each word. Sad business about Mrs. Harper, he said quietly. Very unfortunate timing. Miss Marple looked up with polite interest. Timing often matters more than we realize. Mr. Ellery nodded gravely. Indeed. Financial matters rarely wait upon personal tragedy. The statement was offered cautiously, yet it carried meaning. Miss Marple allowed silence to encourage him further. Mr. Harper, he continued at last, lowering his voice, has experienced certain pressures. Investments that did not mature as expected. Nothing scandalous, of course, but rather urgent. Urgency, Miss Marple said gently, can make life feel very narrow. Yes, he agreed. And Mrs. Harper's recent inheritance would have relieved those pressures considerably. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and departed, without further questions. But her thoughts moved swiftly. Money, she reflected, was rarely dramatic on the surface. It slipped quietly into conversations, strained marriages, and sleepless nights. It explained tensions that politeness otherwise concealed. Outside, the village carried on in its peaceful rhythm. Children chased one another near the green, and Mrs. Price paused to exchange greetings with every passerby. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds lay a subtle alertness. News, even partial news, traveled invisibly. By afternoon, Mrs. Linton confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. Mrs. Harper had indeed inherited a modest sum from a distant cousin only weeks before her passing. She seemed relieved, Mrs. Linton said. Not excited exactly, but settled, as though a burden had lifted. Relief, Miss Marple murmured, suggests a problem had existed. Mrs. Linton leaned closer. There was talk she intended to arrange her affairs differently. Quietly, of course. A sensible precaution, Miss Marple replied. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered Edward Harper outside the grocer's shop. He greeted her courteously, though attention lingered beneath his calm manner. The village has been very kind, he said, though attention can become exhausting. I imagine it must, Miss Marple agreed. Particularly when practical matters demand attention so soon, his expression sharpened slightly. Practical matters? Accounts, correspondence, arrangements, she said mildly. Life rarely pauses for grief. Edward hesitated. Yes, quite. Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his gloves. Not grief, she thought. Anxiety. That evening brought another small revelation. The solicitor in nearby Market Basing confirmed that Mrs. Harper had requested information regarding altering her will. The appointment, however, had never occurred. The inquiry had stopped abruptly. Miss Marple sat quietly with this knowledge, watching dusk settle beyond her window. A woman preparing to change her will. A husband burdened with debts. An inheritance newly acquired. And a letter sent urgently to London that never arrived. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they formed intention. The following morning, Clara Weston appeared unusually distracted at the schoolyard. Miss Marple observed from a distance as the young teacher scolded a child too sharply, then immediately apologized. Her composure was fraying. Miss Marple approached gently. You seem tired, my dear. I have not slept well, Clara admitted. Worry often visits at night, Miss Marple said kindly, particularly when one carries knowledge alone. Clara's eyes lifted quickly. I do not know what you mean. Of course not, Miss Marple replied calmly, offering no challenge. But she noticed again the faint gray marks near Clara's cuffs, carefully cleaned, yet not entirely gone. A suspicious domestic detail lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts, the hearth at Rosebank Cottage. Cleaned too soon, too thoroughly. And now Clara carried traces of ash, though she owned no fireplace. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another brief call at Rosebank Cottage. Edward received her with polite reluctance. The sitting room felt stifling despite the mild weather. Every window remained closed. I find fresh air comforting, Miss Marple remarked lightly. Edward forced a smile. Emily disliked drafts toward the end. An alteration of habit again. Convenient explanations replacing known truths. As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward a small stack of papers upon the writing desk. Several envelopes lay opened, but one space appeared conspicuously empty, as though something had recently been removed. Correspondence can be overwhelming after a loss, she said. Yes, Edward replied quickly. I am sorting through everything. His tone carried defensiveness now. Miss Marple rose soon afterward, but not before noticing a ledger partly concealed beneath the desk blotter. Columns of figures filled the page. Several entries were circled heavily in ink. Debts, she suspected. Imminent ones. Outside, she paused briefly near the hedge, allowing her thoughts to settle. Desperation often transformed ordinary disagreements into irreversible actions. Yet desperation alone did not explain Clara Weston's fear. That answer arrived unexpectedly later that evening when Mrs. Price, brimming with fresh information, confided that Clara had posted a hurried letter earlier that day. She looked quite shaken, Mrs. Price said. Nearly forgot to seal the envelope. Did she indeed? Miss Marple replied softly. A subtle change in behavior. A frightened conscience seeking guidance, perhaps. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple reflected upon human nature. People rarely intend catastrophe. More often, they make one poor decision in a moment of panic and spend the rest of their lives protecting it. She imagined the night again. A confrontation about money, a discovery of debts, perhaps anger, perhaps fear, a struggle not meant to become fatal. And afterward, silence. Windows closed. Evidence burned. Someone else drawn into secrecy. The next morning, another piece fell into place. The bank manager discreetly confirmed that Edward Harper's largest debt was due within days of Mrs. Harper's passing. Without funds, public embarrassment, perhaps ruin, would have followed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Financial desperation, she knew, was among the quietest motives. It left no dramatic trace, only strained voices and hurried decisions. As evening settled over St. Wycliffe, she walked slowly past Rosebank Cottage once more. Edward stood at the window, staring outward, though he did not seem to see the village at all. For a moment his composure slipped, revealing exhaustion and fear. Not grief, Miss Marple thought again. Fear of discovery. A faint movement behind him suggested another presence in the room, Clara Weston, standing uncertainly near the doorway. Their conversation appeared tense, urgent. Shared guilt, perhaps. Or shared knowledge. Miss Marple continued walking, her pace unhurried. The pattern now felt unmistakable. Money had provided motive. The missing letter had threatened exposure. Clara's silence suggested she had witnessed something she wished undone. Yet one question remained unresolved. If Mrs. Harper had merely confronted her husband about debts, why had she cried out so sharply? What had happened in that final moment that transformed argument into tragedy? Miss Marple paused beneath the fading evening light, her expression gentle but thoughtful. Desperation explained motive. Fear explained silence. But somewhere within that quiet cottage lay a single instant, a sudden action that no one had yet described. And until that moment was understood, the cry no one admitted hearing would continue to echo, unanswered through St. Wycliffe. Chapter 6. It was the church clock that drew Miss Marple's attention that morning, though she would later say it was the memory of it rather than the sound itself. Mrs. Linton mentioned quite casually that on the night of Mrs. Harper's passing, the clock had struck 12 only moments after the strange cry was heard. I remember because I counted the chimes, she said thoughtfully. I was lying awake. The details seemed harmless enough, yet Miss Marple felt it settle firmly into place among the others. Time, she reflected, has a way of exposing inaccuracies. People remember it differently when they are anxious. That afternoon she began, very gently, to revisit each account of that night. She did not call it questioning. She called it neighborly conversation. Mrs. Price repeated that she heard something just before midnight, though now she was less certain whether it was precisely before or after. The gardener insisted he had seen a slight figure near the hedge shortly after 11. Young Thomas Bell was firm that the flicker of light in the Harper sitting room came when the clock had just finished striking 12. Miss Marple listened, nodding kindly, allowing the contradictions to breathe. Later she encountered Edward Harper near the lane and remarked, as though in passing, the church clock seemed very loud the other night. I heard it distinctly at midnight. Edward hesitated, only briefly. Midnight? I was asleep well before then. Of course, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Yet he had previously mentioned retiring late due to correspondence. A small inconsistency, but inconsistencies often mark truth's edges. That evening, Miss Marple invited the doctor to share a simple supper. Over quiet conversation, she asked gently about the faint bruise he had observed on Mrs. Harper's wrist. Quite minor, he said at first, then paused, though in retrospect, perhaps not entirely insignificant. It appeared to have been caused by pressure rather than a fall. Pressure? Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, as though someone had gripped her firmly. The remark lingered in the lamplight between them. After the doctor departed, Miss Marple sat quietly for some time. A firm grip. A confrontation. A cry cut short. Windows closed immediately afterward. The following day brought a subtle but telling shift. Clara Weston avoided the main street entirely, choosing instead the narrower path near the fields. Miss Marple, anticipating this, walked the same direction. They met where the hedgerow thinned, leaving no polite means of retreat. "You look pale again, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. Clara attempted a smile. "It has been difficult for everyone." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "particularly for those who heard more than they wished to." Clara's composure faltered. "I heard nothing," she insisted too quickly. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Instead, she said, "It must be dreadful to hear a cry and not know whether to act." Clara stopped walking. There it was, not in words, but in stillness. Clara's voice trembled. "I was not certain what I heard." "Uncertainty," Miss Marple said kindly, "is often what keeps us from doing what we later wish we had done." They walked a few steps more in silence. At last Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I went to see Mrs. Harper that evening. She had sent for me. She was upset." "About the debts?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clara nodded. She had discovered everything. She confronted him. "I was in the garden when I heard raised voices inside." Miss Marple's eyes remained calm. "And then?" "There was a sound. Not a scream exactly. More, sudden, like someone gasping. Then silence." Miss Marple did not interrupt. "I went to the door," Clara continued. "Edward opened it at once. He said Emily had fainted. He looked frightened." "Did you see her?" Clara swallowed. She was in the chair, her head tilted strangely. "He told me she had been weak, that she startled easily. He said I must not spread alarm." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to," Clara admitted, tears rising. "He said if people talked, it would ruin him, that the debts were temporary, that Emily would have hated scandal." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear of scandal was a powerful persuader in a village like St. Wycliffe. "Why were the windows closed?" she asked gently. Clara hesitated. "He closed them after the sound. He said it was nothing, that it would be best if no one thought they heard anything." There it was. Miss Marple walked on beside her, her expression compassionate. "And the hearth?" she asked softly. Clara's eyes filled. There was a letter on the desk. She had written it earlier. He found it after she fell. He said it would destroy him. He begged me to help him. I thought perhaps it was only panic." "So you burned it?" Clara nodded faintly. The truth had begun to surface, not through accusation, but through understanding. That evening, Miss Marple reflected on the sequence carefully. Mrs. Harper confronts her husband about debts. A struggle ensues. He grips her wrist. She pulls away. Perhaps she stumbles. Perhaps he pushes. The impact is sudden. A cry escapes, sharp, cut short. The church clock strikes 12. A light flickers as he moves about the room. Windows are sealed. The letter, evidence of intention, is burned in haste. Clara, drawn into secrecy, carries the ash of guilt upon her gloves. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Rosebank Cottage. Edward greeted her with visible strain. "I wish to say again how sorry we all are," she began gently. "Yes," he replied, though his voice lacked steadiness. "There is one small matter," she continued. "The doctor has reconsidered the bruise on Emily's wrist." Edward's face paled slightly. "He believes it may not have been accidental." Silence filled the room. Miss Marple's tone remained soft. "It is remarkable how often small details refuse to remain hidden. A clock striking 12. A child noticing a flicker of light. ashes darker than usual. Edward's composure began to crack. "It was not meant," he began, then stopped. Miss Marple watched him quietly. "She would not listen," he whispered at last. "She threatened to expose everything. I only meant to calm her." She pulled away. She struck the chair. "And the cry?" Miss Marple asked gently. His voice broke. "I closed the windows so no one would misunderstand." Fear, Miss Marple thought. Fear had guided every action afterward. As she left the cottage, the air felt heavy with approaching revelation. Clara's silence had shielded him, but it could not alter what had occurred in that single fatal instant. The cry had not been imagined. It had been the sound of shock and pain in a room where desperation outweighed restraint. And now, as evening shadows stretched across St. Wycliffe, Miss Marple understood that the truth was no longer buried in ash or hidden behind closed curtains. It stood trembling, waiting to be spoken aloud, and she knew that before another church bell struck midnight, that silence would finally be broken. Chapter 7. The discovery began, as such things often did in St. Wycliffe, with something entirely ordinary. The vicar mentioned during afternoon tea that Edward Harper had finally agreed to allow a proper sorting of Mrs. Harper's belongings. "It seems only respectful," he said gently. "There are papers to organize, charitable matters to settle." His tone was practical, yet Miss Marple noticed the relief beneath it. The village, though polite, had grown restless with uncertainty. Miss Marple expressed quiet approval and offered, almost absent-mindedly, to assist should another pair of careful eyes be useful. The suggestion was accepted readily. Edward Harper, she suspected, found refusal difficult when framed as kindness. That same afternoon she arrived at Rosebank Cottage, accompanied by the vicar. The air inside felt close despite the mild weather, and Miss Marple again noted the firmly shut windows. A faint scent lingered, not fresh smoke, but something older, trapped within curtains and upholstery. Edward appeared weary. The strain of maintaining composure had begun to show in his posture. He spoke politely, yet distraction shadowed every movement. "We shall begin with the sitting room," the vicar suggested. Papers were gathered, drawers opened, small domestic objects handled with reverence. Miss Marple moved slowly, never appearing to search, merely to observe. She examined framed photographs, folded letters, recipe books, the quiet artifacts of a life lived carefully. Then her gaze settled upon the fireplace. The hearth had been scrubbed clean weeks earlier, yet something about its surface troubled her. She knelt slowly, adjusting her glove as though for comfort. Along the inner lining, barely visible against the brick, lay a thin seam, where ash had collected unevenly. "Curious," she murmured lightly. "Ash tends to settle in corners one does not immediately notice." Edward stiffened slightly behind her. The vicar leaned closer. "Shall I fetch the poker?" "Oh, only if convenient," Miss Marple replied gently. When the ash was stirred, several small fragments loosened and fell forward. Among them were blackened scraps, thicker than ordinary paper. One piece bore the faint impression of an embossed seal, partially preserved where flame had not fully consumed it. The vicar frowned. "That appears official." Miss Marple said nothing at first. She merely watched Edward Harper. Color drained slowly from his face. "A solicitor's seal," she said at last, her voice calm. "London, I believe." Edward turned away, gripping the back of a chair. The room grew very quiet. At that moment, footsteps sounded at the doorway. Clara Weston stood there, pale and trembling, as though drawn by inevitability rather than choice. Her eyes fell upon the fragments in Miss Marple's hand, and all remaining composure left her. "I never meant," she whispered. Edward closed his eyes. Miss Marple rose slowly, her manner unchanged, kind, patient, almost grandmotherly. "Miss Weston," she said softly, "truth has a way of asking to be finished." Clara stepped inside, her hands shaking. "Mrs. Harper asked me to come that night. She was frightened. She had discovered the debts. She said Edward had hidden everything." The vicar listened in stunned silence. She planned to send the letter, Clara continued, to protect herself, to change her will. Tears slipped down her face. They argued. I was outside when I heard the sound, that cry everyone speaks of. I ran to the door. Miss Marple watched gently, allowing the memory to unfold. Edward opened it, Clara said. He looked terrified. She was already still. He said she had fallen, that it was an accident. He begged me not to ruin him. He said scandal would destroy everything she cared about. Her voice faltered. The letter lay on the desk. He said it would make people believe the worst. He asked me to help him burn it. I thought I was preventing misery. Edward spoke at last, his voice hollow. I did not intend harm. She threatened to leave. I grabbed her wrist. She pulled away. She struck her head against the chair. He swallowed hard. The sound she made, I still hear it. Silence settled heavily across the room. Miss Marple spoke gently. Fear often persuades people that concealment is kindness. Clara covered her face. I closed the hearth afterward. I thought it would end there, but small things remain, Miss Marple said softly. Ash in corners. Marks upon gloves. Memories carried by those who hear more than they admit. The vicar sank slowly into a chair, deeply troubled. Outside, the village continued peacefully, unaware that truth was unfolding within Rosebank Cottage at last. Miss Marple turned toward Edward. You closed the windows to keep the cry from being heard, she said. He nodded faintly. And afterward she continued. Every action was guided by fear rather than malice. He did not deny it. The pieces now aligned completely. The debts, the inheritance, the missing letter, the sealed windows, Clara's silence. Nothing dramatic. Only human weakness growing into tragedy. Yet one step remained. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused near the doorway and looked back at Edward Harper. His shoulders had slumped, relief and dread mingling upon his face. The village will soon understand, she said gently. Truth rarely stays hidden where so many small eyes observe daily life. Clara looked up anxiously. What will happen now? Miss Marple's expression remained compassionate. That depends upon honesty. Outside, evening light stretched across the garden. Touching the lavender bushes Mrs. Harper had once tended so carefully. The air felt lighter, as though something long held back had finally begun to move. Yet as Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, she reflected that confession spoken privately was not the same as truth spoken aloud. The village still believed Mrs. Harper had passed peacefully. The final understanding had yet to reach those who deserved it. Behind her, Rosebank Cottage stood quiet, holding within it the full story at last. A story born not from cruelty, but from desperation and silence. And Miss Marple knew that before peace could truly return to St. Wycliffe, the cry no one acknowledged would need to be heard by everyone. For until truth was spoken openly, guilt would continue to echo louder than any sound carried through the fog. Chapter 8. The rain began softly that morning, a gentle silver mist settling over St. Wycliffe, as though the village itself wished to move carefully toward whatever awaited it. Mrs. Price remarked that such weather suited reflection, though she said it while watching the lane with unmistakable anticipation. News had not yet spread, but something in the air suggested change. People sensed when a story neared its end, even before they knew its shape. Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage that afternoon, though the gathering was not entirely social. The vicar had requested the presence of several individuals connected, however quietly, to recent events. Edward Harper arrived pale and subdued. Clara Weston came shortly afterward, her composure fragile but determined. Mrs. Linton and the doctor were also present, believing they attended merely a conversation meant to settle lingering doubts within the community. The drawing room glowed warmly despite the gray sky outside. Cups were poured, chairs arranged, polite remarks exchanged, yet beneath the gentle ritual of tea lay unmistakable tension. Miss Marple waited until conversation softened into silence before she spoke. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational. as though recounting an ordinary village anecdote. "It is curious," she began, "how small observations sometimes form a story long before anyone recognizes it." The vicar nodded encouragingly. "In a village," she continued, "life is lived openly. Curtains open at certain hours. Windows remain unlatched in warm weather. Habits become as reliable as the church clock." Mrs. Linton glanced up, recognizing the direction of her thoughts. "When Mrs. Harper's curtains failed to open one morning," Miss Marple said gently, "it seemed a small irregularity. Yet soon afterward came mention of a sound in the night, described not as a lingering cry, but as something sharp, and suddenly ended." Mrs. Price shifted slightly in her chair. "The doctor, quite reasonably, believed Mrs. Harper's passing natural," Miss Marple went on kindly. "But certain details did not agree with that conclusion. A faint bruise upon her wrist. Windows tightly closed despite warm air. A teacup washed unusually carefully." The doctor frowned thoughtfully. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Then came knowledge of an inheritance, and of financial difficulties known only to a few. Mrs. Harper, being practical, sought legal advice. She wrote a letter to a solicitor, a letter that never arrived." Edward Harper's gaze dropped to the floor. "The hearth at Rosebank Cottage," Miss Marple continued softly, "contained fragments of that letter, burned in haste. Ash rarely conceals truth completely." Clara's breath trembled. Miss Marple's tone remained warm, never accusing. Miss Weston visited Mrs. Harper that evening because she had been asked to come. Mrs. Harper had discovered troubling facts regarding her husband's debts and intended to protect herself legally. The room grew utterly still. "There was an argument," Miss Marple said gently, "not uncommon in households where fear has replaced trust. In the course of that argument, Mr. Harper seized his wife's wrist. She struggled to free herself. In pulling away, she struck her head against the chair. Edward closed his eyes. The cry heard by several villagers," Miss Marple continued, "was not wind nor imagination. It was the sound of sudden shock, brief, human, and tragically final. No one spoke. Panic followed," she said softly. "Windows were closed, so the sound might seem unreal. The letter was burned to prevent misunderstanding." Miss Weston, believing she was preserving dignity rather than concealing truth, assisted in silence. Clara wept quietly, though relief mingled with sorrow. Miss Marple looked toward Edward Harper, her expression compassionate rather than severe. "You did not intend harm," she said gently, "but fear led you to hide what should have been faced honestly." Edward's voice broke. "I thought I could spare her reputation, spare us all disgrace." "The desire to avoid shame," Miss Marple replied, "has guided many unfortunate decisions." The vicar spoke quietly then, his voice heavy with understanding. "The truth must be acknowledged." Edward nodded slowly, the struggle leaving him at last. "Yes," he whispered. "It was an accident, but I hid it." The doctor exhaled deeply, realization settling across his features. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, steady and forgiving. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her task nearly complete. "St. Wycliffe is a kind village," she said, "but kindness requires truth. Only then may sympathy be properly given." Silence lingered, not oppressive now, but solemn. Clara wiped her eyes. "I thought silence would protect everyone." "Silence," Miss Marple said gently, "often protects only guilt." The vicar rose, placing a reassuring hand upon Edward's shoulder. Arrangements would follow, formal statements, proper understanding. The slow process by which truth replaces rumor. Yet in that moment, what mattered most had already occurred. The cry no one acknowledged had finally been heard. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked home through the quiet village. Lamps glowed warmly behind cottage windows. Rain faded into mist, softening every outline. Conversations would soon begin, she knew, but they would carry understanding rather than suspicion. Rosebank Cottage stood peaceful at last. Its windows were open, allowing fresh air to move freely through rooms long sealed by fear. Miss Marple paused briefly at the gate. She reflected, as she often did, that tragedy rarely arrived as wickedness. More often it came through ordinary weakness, pride, worry, desperation, allowed to grow unchecked. The village bell rang softly in the distance, marking the hour. Somewhere, a child laughed. A door closed gently. Life resumed its patient rhythm, and Miss Marple, turning toward home with a small, thoughtful smile, considered that the cry in the fog had never truly gone unheard. It had waited only for someone willing to listen carefully enough to understand what lay behind it. With truth spoken and silence lifted, St. Wycliffe settled once more into calm, carrying forward the quiet lesson that even the softest sound may reveal the deepest truth, if one listens with both kindness and clarity. The mystery of Rosebank Cottage was finished, its shadows dissolved not by accusation, but by understanding. And as the mist drifted away into the darkening countryside, peace returned at last, gentle and complete. The days that followed unfolded gently, as life in St. Wycliffe always did after disturbance. There was no sudden drama, no raised voices in the streets, only the slow and careful adjustment of understanding. News traveled quietly from door to door, softened by kindness before it reached listening ears. The villagers spoke of Mrs. Harper with renewed sympathy, no longer comforted by the simple explanation of illness, but touched instead by the sadness of human frailty. Edward Harper left the cottage some weeks later. Arrangements were handled respectfully, without spectacle. The vicar ensured that conversations remained compassionate rather than judgmental, reminding everyone that tragedy often grows from fear rather than cruelty. Clara Weston continued teaching at the school, though she moved through her days with a quieter seriousness. The burden she had carried alone had lifted, replaced by the difficult peace that comes when truth is finally shared. The children noticed only that she smiled more gently now, as though relieved of a weight they could not name. Rosebank Cottage stood empty for a time. Its garden, once so precisely tended, softened into natural growth. Lavender leaned over the path, and roses climbed freely along the fence. Eventually, the windows were opened wide again, allowing sunlight and fresh air to move through rooms that had once held silence too tightly. The village approved of this change without saying so aloud. Open windows felt like honesty restored. Miss Marple resumed her ordinary routines. She walked the lanes, exchanged small pleasantries, and listened more than she spoke. To an outsider, nothing about her life appeared remarkable. Yet those who knew her well understood that she observed everything, not with suspicion, but with patient understanding of human nature. One afternoon, Mrs. Linton remarked that it was comforting how peacefully everything had settled. Almost as though nothing had happened, she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, something always happens," she replied gently. "But villages are rather wise. They remember only what helps them live kindly afterward." She reflected often on Mrs. Harper, not with sadness alone, but with quiet respect. Emily Harper had tried to protect herself, to bring order where secrecy had grown. In the end, it was not malice that ended her life, but a moment of desperation, a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives may change when fear replaces honesty. As summer deepened, St. Wycliffe returned fully to its familiar rhythm. Church bells rang on Sundays. Children's laughter filled the green. Even Mrs. Price found new topics for speculation, though she occasionally lowered her voice when passing Rosebank Cottage, as if acknowledging a lesson learned. One evening, Miss Marple paused by her window as mist drifted once more across the fields. The village lights glowed softly, each one representing a household with its own secrets, hopes, and quiet struggles. She understood, as she always had, that mysteries rarely belonged to grand crimes or clever schemes. They lived instead in ordinary hearts, in pride, fear, love, and misunderstanding. The cry that once echoed through the fog had faded now, not forgotten, but understood. And understanding, Miss Marple believed, was the truest form of justice a small village could offer. With a contented sigh, she drew the curtains closed for the evening, leaving St. Wycliffe wrapped in calm once more, its peace restored not by silence, but by truth gently brought into the light.